To get us started, please allow me to introduce Georgian's own Courtney Duthie, class of 2014 and 2017, who works with our institutional research and strategic insights team as a research analyst, and who will serve as our moderator today. Courtney is a double alum of Georgian, serves as a research analyst instructor, and is a current member of the Georgian Board of Governors. Previously, Courtney also served on Georgian's Alumni Association Executive Council, and her keen eye for detail and strong educational background has assisted her in using data to uncover insights and drive strategic decision-making in her various roles with Georgian. What sets Courtney apart is her creativity and out-of-the-box thinking, always striving to approach problems from different angles to come up with innovative solutions. As a strong communicator, Courtney is also able to translate complex data into compelling insights that resonate with various audiences. Throughout her academic and professional career, Courtney has had the opportunity to work on a variety of projects spanning different industries, from consumer goods to education, and she is currently pursuing her Master's of Business Administration, Business Analytics. Currently, Courtney, we're thrilled to have you join us, and we really appreciate you serving as our moderator today. Over to you.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you to the Advancement and Alumni Relations team for organizing this event. I'm thrilled to be part of this series because I love discussing data. Recently, I had the pleasure of speaking with both Madison and Ethan while planning for today. We had a great conversation about the latest trends in data and research. It seems like we could have talked for hours about this topic. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion today. So it is now my pleasure to introduce our two panelists with whom I've known for quite a few years now and who we will spend the afternoon with. The first, a warm welcome to Madison Charman, class of 2020, who serves as the organizational researcher with the Barrie Police, is currently completing her PhD, and who is an alum of the Design and Visual Arts Research Analyst Program. With a bachelor's, master's, and almost a PhD in criminology, she blends her academic expertise with a first-hand understanding of police operations. Madison is at the forefront of merging evidence-based methodologies with practical applications within law enforcement. In her role, she brings theological insights and actively translates them into actionable strategies, thereby making sure research has a seat at the table in operational and strategic decision-making at the Barrie Police Service. Madison has been working with the Barrie Police Service in applied research since 2020. Madison's doctoral research at Ontario Tech University looks at public acceptance of police technology and its impact on police literacy and trust. So please welcome Madison. And we are also eager to welcome Ethan Davis, class of 2018 from Design and Visual Arts Big Data Analytics Program. Ethan is a seasoned expert in data integration and analytics, currently serving as the Budget Planning Director at Infrastructure Ontario, where he leads data-driven initiatives for large-scale infrastructure projects. With over 8 years of experience in fostering data-centric decision-making, Ethan has helped organizations optimize operations and drive performance through strategic data management. In addition to his corporate role, he is a professor of analytics and machine learning, sharing his expertise with the next generation of data professionals. Ethan is passionate about cultivating a data-driven mindset to unlock innovation and organizational growth. Welcome, Ethan.
Thanks, Courtney. Happy to be here.
Okay, so in today's discussion, I'm excited to touch on a few key topics. So the first is the importance of data. So data is the core of decision-making across industries, driving innovation, strategy, and growth. The next topic was data literacy. As data becomes more accessible, it's critical for everyone, not just experts, to understand how to read, interpret, and use data efficiently and effectively. And then the last one is perception versus reality. Often our assumptions don't align with what the data reveals. Bridging this gap is key to making informed and unbiased decisions. So with that, I would like to ask us to start off with the foundation. So what does it mean to have a data-driven mindset? Madison, can you get us started with this question?
Absolutely. Thank you, Courtney. And it's awesome to be here. So what does it mean to have a data-driven mindset? To me, it's really about prioritizing data, obviously, and not making decisions based on, gut feelings or traditional anecdotes. I feel like that, especially in a policing industry, has kind of just always been the way we do it, is however we feel. And there's a lot of emotions involved in decision making. So, my role within the police service is really questioning everything we do. And it's asking, is what we're doing working? How do we know it's working? How do we measure this impact that it's having? Is this approach rooted in research or evidence? So I think having a data-driven mindset, you have to really be ready to prioritize like that objective, quantifiable information to guide your decision-making, and also be ready to learn from the data, especially when it says what you don't want it to hear, which oftentimes will happen, or it doesn't say what your leadership wants it to say. So, I work with implementing evidence-based policing at the Barrie Police, which is really about giving research and data a seat at the table and putting it on a pedestal in terms of decision making, and, always approaching things with curiosity.
Thanks, Madison. I love the mention of giving data the seat at the table when it comes to decision making. Ethan, what are your thoughts on this?
I love Madison's final statement there of curiosity, because I think curiosity and being inquisitive is the foundation of a data-driven mindset, right? It always starts, no matter what you're doing in organizations or in academia or anything else, it starts with your fundamental question of why. And that's where everything begins. And then you start to ask those follow-up questions, like, how can I better understand what I'm looking at? Or are we covering all the variables? Or does this actually look right? Is what I'm looking at accurate? And we have to just continuously ask all of those questions. And fortunately, those are general questions that we can ask pretty much in every asset of our lives. It doesn't have to be just for work. It doesn't have to be school. It can be at home. Why am I doing it this way? Why are we doing, is this working for me the way we're executing our family structure or whatever it happens to me? It doesn't matter what it is. We can always ask those questions. And a really great example of this is Netflix. For those of us who are a little bit old enough to remember when Netflix first started out, they were actually a DVD rental company that they mailed you the DVDs and you mailed them back. And for a while, this was going really, really well for Netflix. And then all of a sudden, they had a huge drop in subscribers, and no one wanted that service anymore. So they went to that question, why? Why are we losing customers right now? And it turned out when they went to their customers and asked this question, the fundamental issue there was just they were getting lots of delays in the mailing. They weren't getting their movies because you want to watch your movie on Friday night or Saturday night, and you weren't getting that. And they took that information and built a streaming platform to eliminate, right, the mailing feature of it. And then they didn't stop there. They went, what underlying patterns of behavior do our clients have in terms of what are they watching? Why are they watching this? And that's what gave rise to that whole recommendation engine that they built, right? When you go into Netflix, it's like recommended for you. All of that was based on asking that question, why, and how can I understand this over and over, until we got to some really complex math that personalizes your whole Netflix experience, and it revolutionized the entire industry for consuming kind of media.
I love that both of you kind of were the curious skill set. You both mentioned it, and it's the hows and the whys around it. And I think that's such a critical skill, not only for the experts, but just people in general, to always go back to that why, the why and the how. So that's excellent that you both had kind of mentioned and spoke on that. Ethan, I'm going to come back to you again. Can you tell us about the role data literacy plays in developing a data mindset? This is kind of a a two-part question here. Are there any training and resources needed to enhance data literacy, and what barriers are faced when interpreting research and data?
Yeah, so data literacy is, no matter which way you look at it, fundamental for developing these data-driven mindsets. It enables the organizations and institutions that we are with and individually effectively to understand and interpret data and make decisions based on it. But when we use the term data literacy, it kind of sounds maybe a little intimidating and a little like more complicated than it really is. And the reality is most people already have the skill set to be data literate and to understand what they're looking at. They have this foundational understanding of data analysis because that's kind of what our brains are hardwired to do, right? Our thoughts are always trying to predict the next thing that's going to happen. So all we have to do is take kind of our current understanding and apply it to all circumstances. If I look at a weather forecast and it says one day it's going to be 20% likely to rain and the next day is 80% likely to rain, I kind of know which day I'm going to go outside, right? And so we kind of already have that understanding. And so you don't need to be someone who's building, that complex Netflix recommendation system to be data literate. You just kind of have to apply the math you learned in elementary and middle school and high school to kind of just what's happening around you. What becomes even more powerful, I think, is the ability to spot bad analytics and bad faith analytics, right? We see a lot in an increasingly polarized political landscape. People like to use numbers to drive their narratives, and we can cherry pick those numbers and use them to try to support whatever we want to convince someone of. And that's where things get a lot more difficult. So when we get into those circumstances, it's really important to start asking questions like, who actually conducted this? Where are these numbers actually coming from? And the person who made these numbers, what are they looking to gain? Is this purely academic and this is for public knowledge to become part of a public body? Or is this person trying to sell me on something or convince me to vote for them or, sway my opinion one way or the other? And it's when we start to really think about those questions that maybe some of those red flags that we may have overlooked start to shine through a little bit. Even in when information is displayed graphically, I always like to use the example of pie charts with my students. You can really make a pie chart look fairly disingenuous, right? You can really skew the visual and make it seem like something is much more disproportionate than the others, depending on what you're doing. And the general rule there, this is where the actual gut feeling does come into play, though, because if it smells off, if it seems like someone's trying to be a little shoddy, then there's a good chance that it is, and that you can kind of start to look into it more. If you're looking more for a refresher on, numbers and that sort of thing, there's lots of free courses out there, Khan Academy and LinkedIn Learning now, that everyone has all access to if they want to go back and look at some of those fundamentals of math or fundamentals of visualization of data and graphing and that sort of thing. So the information and availability is endless. But to your question about barriers, now barriers often, I have my experience, come in the way of people. People don't like to change from that gut feeling. Everyone wants to, they think they know better because of their experience, or they think they know better because of, that's just how they feel, or they know better, or whatever it happens to be. And that becomes the larger challenge when it comes to data literacy.
That's great. And I align with you when you mentioned about the students and the pie. Actually, when you were mentioning about the audience and going down to the root of where the source is coming from, that's week 2 in my course, first semesters. We have the students go through, okay, look at a source. I want you to evaluate for me. Who is the audience? Who is the expert that wrote it? Are they expected? All of those pieces. So that's great that you added that, because that's definitely a fundamental of data literacy. Madison, so what are your thoughts on this?
I wish I could show a picture. It's a meme, I guess, and it's a tweet, and I forget who it's from, but it's like, being literate is being able to, or empowers you to tell when something's full of blank. And so I think, going off of Ethan's point, right? Empowering yourself with that knowledge, like you said, being able to really critically analyze things and kind of tell when things are off. I always hear the phrase, like, if you torture stats long enough, it'll tell you what you want. And that's just not an ethical use of what we do, or an ethical way to be, data driven and have that mindset. But for me, data literacy is kind of two things. So it's understanding where your data is coming from and what it's telling you. So when it comes to that data-driven mindset, it's really key to know what data your organization even tracks or has and who's the gatekeeper of it. It's also great, if possible, to see how it's collected. So in my framework and in my kind of environment, right, like, it's very manual data input based on, calls for service that come into a police station. Here's your lat long, here's this person's name, date of birth, and certain things that'll populate. And just knowing what certain fields mean, or the interpretation process to input that data, in our 911 communication center, and then watching how records then translates it and what fields and drop downs they choose for different things. Knowing the story and the pathway of how your data kind of makes it to you is really important, because it helps you have better insights and better interpretations. Because if something is, coded or flagged in a certain way, and one person thinks it means this, but you've seen that process and kind of the mindset and thinking behind and the rationale behind that, I think that's really a key, to help with your analysis. And really, police data is notoriously dirty data. You're a lot of time spent cleaning it up, because our systems are really just made for, records keeping and input, and not analysis. And I'm sure, depending on where you start your data journey, this may be the case as well, right? Like, some of these systems aren't set up really for rigorous analysis, and there's a lot of data cleaning, and there's a lot of learning in terms of how your data is inputted. So, I just find too, when it comes to data literacy and like a data-driven mindset, to know when you're dealing with kind of that crappy data that we were talking about, or like I said, being able to call it out when it's used or not used with integrity, or, being able to critically assess the quality of it, know its limitations, like, that's a key too, right? We can be asked as, the data people in an organization a question, but knowing that, if something's not tracked very well, or here's the limitations of our data, I think that's key. When it comes to further learning too, I would recommend this is, you may not need as much knowledge as you think to get started. And I would, caution against thinking you have to have this perfect portfolio to dive in. Some of the things we do here are very, very simple. It's not, Ethan is a big deal and does all these crazy cool calculations, but a lot of the places it's even just Excel and pivot tables and kind of descriptives to start out. So there's, you can really dip your toes without having to come in with as like a proper data scientist and master of all knowledge. And there's a lot of ways to learn that. Like Ethan said, like, I YouTubed, my Georgian analyst, I always tell Magda, my Excel class was the most helpful class I've ever taken. So yeah, you don't have to make it as big and scary as it may seem.
I love that.
Can I
Yeah,
jump
sorry,
in
Ethan,
just
go ahead.
for one moment? Sorry, Courtney, I don't mean to cut you off. And
No, it's okay.
to what Madison was talking about before. So I don't know about big deal, but I've done a lot of analytics programs over the last and projects over the last almost decade, and I would say of all of it, there might have been one really complicated thing that was built. To Madison's point, it's almost exclusively descriptive analytics and linear regressions of some form, which is something that most people have done at some point in their middle school and high school career. So even when we like to use names like data scientists and everything else, we're really just doing the same kind of the more sexy sounding algorithms, but they just come down to regressions and descriptive statistics.
And and I love that too. When Madison also was talking about this, just like the going down to the simple and the basics. I have a lot of students who are really terrified of their stats course, and we're all alumni from programs that have statistics in it. And I tell them, you just need to know the foundations of it, really. If someone is doing the advanced analytical work, that's a skill set that they have. But coming out as analysts, there's going to be a variety of different work out there that we're doing, and In my case, like the two of you, I use Excel quite a bit. That is pretty much what I do a lot of my analysis in, and that is one of my main tools. And that's a tool that's accessible to everyone, right? For the most part anyways. So I'm going to just skip to our question 3 here, which aligns into kind of the decision making. So in today's climate, understanding data analytics and its role in decision making is becoming increasingly critical to building effective strategies. So let's dive into the importance of understanding research and data analytics. Madison, could you share more about how individuals and teams can adopt this data-driven approach? And are there any effective strategies for fostering a culture of data-driven decision-making?
I wish I had a very easy, simple answer to this question because it would make my life much easier. I mean, a lot of this goes back to that idea of like fostering and cultivating curiosity, like having an organization that's willing to learn and dig deeper into questions and really think critically. You know, in an industry like policing, it is really tough to bring change and a focus on data when, you know, experience and lived experience and 30 years on the job has really been the holy grail for so long. So that in and itself is a really tough sell sometimes. And you may find in your careers, like, you know, to you, it seems so simple, the data saying this, but that can actually be a really tough sell, depending on who you're talking to. I find, you know, really cultivating that culture and of curiosity is empowering people to engage with the data as much as possible and make it relevant to them. So, you know, our crime maps, right? We have public facing crime maps, internal facing crime maps with different information that, you know, anybody who's really interested internally can go in and kind of play and see, oh, what are the trends? What's happening here? And having these really user-friendly dashboards, or, you know, having officers that are interested in, you know, a certain type of crime that they want to specialize in. Well, they can then go on the dashboards and see where is that happening most frequently, who is doing it, and kind of like playing with the data themselves to show, oh, this can actually be a really useful tool. Maybe it's worth listening to. So I think that really helps. And, you know, finding champions within is always going to be your key. You have to find those people that have enough pull and enough respect internally to then kind of be your champions to say, well, have you thought about looking at the dashboard, or have you thought about asking the analyst unit about this question? And I think that really helps too in terms of kind of fostering that curiosity.
I love that, putting like the data in their hands that they can use as well. And in institutional research where I am, we also have dashboards, and people will come to us and ask questions, and we do the same thing, like, hey, did you know we have this dashboard? Like, and they can go through and find this information, and it's very helpful. And we've, similar to your note, we've designed them in a way that it's easy for them to digest and easy for them to understand. And I think that's really important too when we're giving them that information. Ethan, what is your advice for overcoming common challenges and resistance to adopting a data-driven approach?
Yeah, Madison touched on some really crucial points, and I'll maybe build on it a little bit. So your data champions are your most reliable people there. If you can get, you know, one or two or more really influential people who start to point at it, a lot of people will jump on that bandwagon. And then once that data is in their hands and they start to play with it, they almost start to come to their own conclusion and their own what they thought was gut instinct. The data now becomes their new gut instinct, or their new you know, oh, I'm feeling this way. Once they start to look at it and they look at it and they look at it, and then they start to kind of come to their own conclusion, and then they really start to get on board once they've been able to play with that a little bit more. And it's just a kind of reorganization of thinking of, instead of going to my history, I'm going to this dashboard, right? And it becomes everyone's learned experience instead of just my learned experience. But getting there, yeah, is absolutely can be very difficult, right? Organizational change is always very hard. What is it? I think it's Harvard Business Review always likes to spout that the most dangerous words in business are that's the way we've always done it. And we all know that, but none of us ever actually listen to that advice, because doing the same thing that we've always done is very comfortable. It's really great when we always continue to do it the same way and we don't have to put any time and energy into making something change. And that's where I think to get people to change, individuals need to align their priorities with the data priorities, with the business priorities, or the institutional priorities in the case of police. So when everyone goes, oh, we're all on the same page here, that's when you can really drive things forward. But getting everyone on that page is very difficult at times. And one of the other really big barriers, and what I've seen across my experience, is actually you just mentioned how great Excel is, and Excel is a great document, but it's almost too easy to generate files, right? Every single person at a 5,000 person institution can bring up Excel and put a bunch of information in it and save it for later. So all of a sudden you have millions upon millions of files from people just opening Excel and creating something new several times a day for their entire career, and then trying to parse through that and trying to standardize it or interpret it or get it into a system where it can be all aggregated in one spot and reported on together can be very, very difficult. And to Madison's point about data cleaning, there's another professor in the big data program, Saber, who always likes to say 50% of an analyst's job is cleaning the data and the other 50% is cleaning the data. Because in the vast majority of situations, that is the ultimate time suck. And the fun part of it, of actually doing the analytics, is like the last week of the job, or after you've got everything standard and in place and filled out, and then then we can actually get that.
Can I add on to that, Courtney?
Yeah, go ahead.
And like, I find too, something that helps is, and this has been like my secret power, is like finding a way for them to need the data and have it work for them. So let's say they want to start a new project, or somebody wants to acquire a piece of tech or equipment. Like being like, oh, did you know, we can look at our data that can help you support that business case or these pieces too. So like trying to also have them realize it can be a tool is huge, because I've done that. And now at the start of anybody's idea, they'll come knock on our door and be like, hey, do you have any data that can help us with this business case? And, it's not about twisting it, but it's about them going like, oh, let me see if the data can help support my point here. And then that's kind of now a starting point. And I think, having it work with them is kind of turns them into a believer. And then they come back every time they have an idea, right?
Yeah, I love that. That's a great superpower, Madison, that you just mentioned there. And with Ethan too, about the 50%, I do think people underestimate how much time it does take to clean data. And it's almost like there's an assumption that you can just switch a switch and you got clean data. And I would probably say most of the time I don't get clean data to my computer. So no, that's great to emphasize on kind of that work of the process and the time and the effort that goes into that. So we are about at the halfway mark here, and I know we have some more questions, so I'd love to fit in a couple more here. My next question relates to AI and ethics in the world of data and research. So Ethan, what ethical considerations are important to understand when working with data, and how do we decide what data matters, and can we trust the data that is generated from AI?
Oh yeah, that's a multi-part question there. So
that could be a webinar on its own.
Yeah, absolutely. So data has always been really powerful, right? We just have easier access to it. You go back to Alan Turing, right? He cracked Enigma in World War II, and it changed, the shape of the war. All of a sudden, maybe things would have been very different if he hadn't have been able to, get those communications from the Germans and translate them using, his computer, his Turing machine. That's one example of using it, well, I guess from our perspective, ethically for good, because now, we ended up with our modern day society. But the reality is for most analysts, there is no legal implications for not being ethical with our data. If you look at some of the larger consulting companies, they have the data on how addictive opioids are, right? And they use that to make pharmaceutical companies billions of dollars with very little repercussions and changing, the face, creating an opioid crisis across the world, for profit, with very little repercussions there. So, if we're going to go back to quoting Spider-Man, right, with great power comes great responsibility, right? So we should always be very vigilant with our data, and we should always be considering who is this impacting when we release our information, or when we use it to support conclusions, or use it to support the research that we're doing. And I think that becomes more of a philosophical and societal question. But yeah, I think that all of us kind of do have a moral obligation to make sure we are working with, being ethical with our data. When it comes to data generated from AI, it can be really useful. Absolutely. When we're building different calculations, we're building algorithms, whatever, it doesn't matter what they are, using sample data that's been generated can be really helpful to train that and build that to what it needs to be. But I wouldn't say it's something that you want to fundamentally rely on, because it does come back to it's much better to really understand the data that you're working with, instead of just blindly taking, numerical or whatever generated data from AI, because AI can be very biased. It's biased towards the information it has access to. That might be a subset of social media. That might be social media, period, but that's only a subset of the information. So we always have to be very careful with our experimental design and where we're getting that data, and if we truly understand it, and if we're missing anything, if there's a portion of the population or a portion of the data set that's being excluded. That's how we get into these really problematic situations happening, where we rely on this data that's biased towards people or a product or something else. So we have to be very careful with it. I wouldn't say trust it all inclusively, but it's definitely useful in a lot of different circumstances.
Yeah, I would even add, even for the uploading part. So I've heard some people want to upload their data to AI and just caution that that is publicly available now.
Yes.
So you have to be very, very careful with how you're using that. And I personally do not do that approach because I use sensitive information and I don't want that in the public and accessible now. So
yeah,
that was great, Ethan, about kind of the cautions of using AI, but also kind of almost the benefits of how it can help. Madison, what are your thoughts on AI and ethical considerations with it?
The ethical considerations of AI, I am on the same page as Ethan. I don't have a whole bunch of experience with it, but I think that's really where that data literacy piece comes in, like being able to always thinking critically, always questioning the source and the integrity of the data you're working with is huge. But on the ethics of, data and using data generally, it plays a huge part, and you kind of have to be your own ethics board. Like Ethan said, like it's not like we took an oath to a code to do no harm. But I think you really need to approach it that way. So I'm very conscious of the data points, especially working in policing, because my data points are often people or people's trauma or something extremely horrible that happened to somebody. I'm looking at victims of crime, perpetrators of crime, locations where people are more likely to be victimized. And so I think there's, people are my data points, and you really need to weigh that when doing any kind of analysis, interpreting findings, and giving recommendations. You really need to like humanize that process. And it's really easy to just have these big data sets and do these analysis and here's my findings, but humanizing that piece and understanding the impacts of somebody, for example, to get on my data points takes a lot of consideration, and I really have to tread that lightly. Or even the ethics when I'm presenting information out to the community, like understanding what they want to hear, what level of transparency, how do I protect people's private information, while also trying to balance the line of transparency with police data. And so that's a whole other kind of beast in and of itself, but you have to be your own ethics board, really.
I loved your point, and I think it's really critical is kind of the humans behind the data, because a lot of the time we'll just see numbers they're just quantifiable variables, but it's like there's actually a human being behind that. So I loved your emphasis on that element of it. Okay, so for our final question, I'd like to touch on building effective strategies. How can we translate data into actionable outcomes within a team or an organization? And are there metrics for measuring the effectiveness of data-driven approach? So Madison, I'll turn to you first for your final thoughts on this question.
Yeah, oh boy, translating data. Translating data into outcomes in an organization can either be really easy or really hard. It really depends on your audience, your leadership, your decision makers, and their commitment to those data-driven approaches. And I'm sure, Ethan, you feel me on this. One of the biggest aspects of being a data person is really that realities versus perceptions and what people feel. And sometimes the data doesn't tell their truth. And that's a really tough spot to be in. You know, for example, our data can say that an area is relatively safe, and therefore we don't need to expand really expensive police resources in that spot. But the people who live on that street, you know, feel differently. And we need to kind of balance that perception versus reality. It's not as black and white as us data people would probably like it to be in terms of, well, this is the data, it's objective. You know, people's feelings and emotions and attachment to that can get really, really messy. So I think, you know, we also just need to be an advocate for the data and that data-driven decision-making wherever we can. You know, that knowledge translation, like how you sell and package your data, is such a skill. It's so huge. You really have to be the translator between the data and the so what, and you know, why people should care. Why do they need to know? Why are they sitting there listening to you? What do they need to take away from that? So it's really not about just telling people what they want to hear, but you know, finding a tactful way to deliver some of those messages, especially if it goes against what they're looking for, but also maintaining the, you know, the integrity of what you found.
No, that's great. And I hear this too from students as their biggest challenge is they don't want to give bad news, or they don't want to give the news that their audience is not expecting. It's like, well, that's what your role is. You need to provide that data, and whether it's good news or bad news, and making that into those actionable elements for the client or the organization. Ethan, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's absolutely Madison's point of perception versus reality. The classic example, right, of airplanes are the safest way to fly, but yet there's a lot of people who are terrified of flying, and will jump in a car that statistically is far more dangerous to be in than ever getting in an airplane. So that becomes the perception, and sometimes and even further to telling your truth, where if someone's already made a commitment that, hey, this is what we know, and then we come to a situation where the data doesn't support that, people are very hesitant to maybe not rely on that data, but publicly display that data so they don't want to look like they're fools in front of their peers or something like that. But what I think in terms of these effective strategies, like most things, everything almost comes down to different forms of communication. If I can communicate to senior leadership group the effectiveness of this data, and they are going to have that trickle down to the rest of the organization, that is an excellent way to do it. We talked about getting the data in people's hands. Getting data in people's hands via dashboards or whatever else is just another communication strategy to help people buy into it. So we have a number of things like that. And then in terms of, we absolutely have measurable ways of tracking how useful this information is, and usually in the form of a key performance indicator, right? Is when we use a key performance indicator, we can benchmark. For example, Royal Victoria Hospital did this really neat thing several years ago about hand washing, where they were trying to reduce the rate of infections in the hospital by increasing the rate that people were washing their hands. And by people, I mean everyone in the hospital, the nurses, the doctors, the patients, the office workers, everyone who was in there, because every time you get any sort of bacteria built up in a hospital, it can transmit very quickly. So they ran this campaign. Everyone, it was easy to kind of look at the data to say, yes, bacteria causes infection. hand washing reduces bacteria. So they ran this campaign, putting flyers everywhere and these educational seminars that were like, wash your hands at these points in the day. And they got it to, and they actually got people to report on it. I think it was self-reported, so it's not always spectacular, but they got to basically 98% of the time people were washing their hands, and they were able to translate that to a reduced risk of infection across the hospital. And they used that by their KPI was wash your hands, let's say 8 times a day. Let's try to get up to 10 times a day. And then you could also monitor the rate of infections over time to see how this went. That was a really great use of adopting the data from research in terms of bacterial infections to organizational research in terms of people washing their hands, in terms of also organizational research and reduced infections.
What a great example. I didn't know, I wasn't aware of that one. So that is quite interesting. So, and I also just wanted to note too, when you mentioned the audience and methods of communication, this can vary too. Like you can have the same data, but depending on your audience, you might be reporting it differently, whether that's in a dashboard or a one-pager for the executives or a longer report for maybe middle management who need to do some action with their team. So I think that's also important too, that we can take the data, but we can also communicate it in different ways for different audiences. So that's a key part of what I do too with Georgian College. So I'm just checking time here. It looks like we have time for 1 or 2 questions from the audience. So if you have questions, please use the Q&A button and we'll try to get answers to a few of the questions within this time slot here. I'm just going to check our question box here. Okay, so we do have a question here. And this kind of goes on to what I just mentioned about communicating. So what challenges do you face when communicating your research results? We'll go with Ethan first, see if.
Sure, happy to start here. So this is kind of an interesting question because the thing that I face the most, my company has this glorified idea of a one source of truth. We all like to say, oh, well, what's the real source of truth of this information? And the reason why I say glorified is because there's never a real source of truth for it. There's always an opinion, or there's real, or there's a different data set, or there's a different whatever, this is where things can get a little bit messy, because when I'm communicating these results, or I'm communicating, might be budgets or numbers for money or whatever it happens to be, I can spout it, and then someone else from another team who's working on a different data set that might be kind of similar, might have some relevance, but with different definitions will be like, oh, well, that's not what we're tracking to because we have this information. And I find the biggest challenge organizationally becomes a misalignment of information and where people are actually pulling their information from, and comparing, let's say apples to apples and apples to oranges, but without like a really streamlined set of definitions and really streamlined set of what we'll call metadata or information about the data that we're working with, it becomes very difficult to communicate a single truth because there never really is a single truth. That's not, unfortunately, not the way the world works.
No, that's a great response. And for having those definitions and the metrics and the processes to how you calculate something is very important to see how in different teams, different departments, how they're getting that result. Madison.
Yeah, I kind of take this 2 ways. So one, I go again, like perception versus reality. So a big role that I have is presenting our police statistics to the public through our board reports. And, like we said, sometimes the data doesn't always align with what people feel or their own perceptions of safety. And so sometimes you are kind of that person delivering a message where, you may get a little bit of pushback, and you have to, I don't want to say stand your ground, but just be really confident and understand that, well, this is what the data is saying, and really grounded in that truth and as truthful as possible. You know what I mean? We just talked about multiple
Yes.
truths, but the integrity of it, and kind of also being unapologetic about not making it work for your purpose. This is objective as objective as we can get. But then also when I think of communicating data, gauging your information to the literacy of the audience that you're speaking to is key. So, in my work, I will speak with, professors and academics, and there's a certain level of understanding and acknowledgement to that. Or I'm speaking with police officers who, could really care less about what method I use to get to the number, just want to know what the number is and what it means to them. And so I think it's really trying to understand kind of the literacy of your audience and how that's going to then change the story that you have to tell about the data. The key idea won't change, right? You're continuing to be and have that integrity with your data, but how you deliver it or the key takeaways per audience is going to differ, and that's huge.
Yeah, you are so right there. Those takeaways will be different from various audiences. Okay, so we have one final question before we wrap up. I know we touched on a little bit of tools, but I thought this question came in. So what tools or software do you use to analyze data? I know we mentioned Excel, but is there anything else that you think people should know about, or that they could maybe experiment and play around with?
Yeah, sure. I'll jump on this one because we use quite a bit of different things at where I am. Everyone always has access to Excel, so there's never harm in learning, advanced Excel skills, including your things like macros, programmatically doing Excel work, which is great. Second to that, for data storage, we have two kind of fundamental things. We use SQL databases or relational databases, but we also have access to something that is called Azure Data Lake, which is just a very, very large storage system for storing data in a cloud-based environment. So that's more of a storage part, but now we have a couple of different tools at our disposal for analysis. Microsoft Databricks, which is built on something called Apache Spark, which we use Python to communicate with, Python and on R to communicate with, and do our analysis and make sure that it is running very smoothly and efficiently. Those are the main tools that we use. There's a few others that, if I go back to my experience in the Ontario Public Service, it's more like their analytics teams use a lot more SAS, which is great too, can be really great, useful analytics software as well.
Great, thank you. Madison?
Yeah, I would echo that. We have, it's so funny because I am not the person that pulls the data. We have a very, very amazing person here that does that. And she always talks about a data lake. And I really just picture it as a lovely, serene lake. And, that's just my extent of the knowledge. So it goes to show you, depending on where you are in the process of data, I don't have to touch a data lake. I don't have to go there. For me, in terms of the tools, it's okay, now that I've given you, the request or the data dump that you're looking for, then I do something with it. And yeah, that's where SAS, SPSS, Excel, all of those things come in. I've heard a lot with Tableau. Same thing, Ethan, with, accessing data through SQL and SQL Server, and good old merges in Excel and unique identifiers. That's really just how I live my life. So a lot of that stuff, though, you'll learn as you go, right? Your different organizations are going to have access to different tools. So that kind of stuff, it's easy. Once you have the foundations, it's easier to learn a tool because it's really just user experience at that point. So I say learn the basics. Everywhere's going to have access to Excel. You can do a majority of the stuff you're looking for in terms of basic analysis in Excel, and then just kind of like make sure you stay curious and keep up. One day I hope to learn coding and like R and Python. I think that's so cool, but that is currently beyond my capability, but like always keeping curious and wanting to learn.
Madison, you and I are on the same page here. We have two talented senior analysts who do kind of more of the advanced work and the dashboarding. So I haven't got to my part in that, but with my MBA in business analytics, that's my goal. I know SAS is in my program, so down the road. But yeah, I think that's great about the Excel, and just stay curious. Great ending there. As data users, just stay curious. And that wraps up our questions, and I'm going to bring Kelly back on here for our final message.
Oh, thank you so much. I learned so much today. I've been writing some of what you've been saying down by hand. I love the quote, 50% is cleaning the data and the other 50% is cleaning the data. I'm going to send that out to our team. And then also about, maintaining ethical data. If you torture stats long enough, it will tell you what you want. I think that's a great quote. Anyway, thank you so much for your wisdom. Courtney, Madison, Ethan, thank you for sharing your knowledge and expertise on developing a data-driven mindset and how important data is to building effective and tangible strategies. We really appreciate everything you're doing for our global alumni community and on behalf of our department. As a special thank you, we'll be making a donation to Student Financial Aid to thank you for what you've done. To all of our alumni watching, please remember your Alumni Engagement Office has a range of resources available to you to build your professional network and to connect with fellow alumni. You can visit georgiancollege.ca/alumni to learn more about these services. And just a reminder, we will be adding this webinar to our library of speaker series topics. So if you'd like to share that with colleagues, you can find the recordings to this speaker series and others on our web pages. Enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you for watching the Alumni Speaker Series.